Fog doesn't just hide things. It compresses distance until a shadow can be 3 feet away and a mile away at the same time. It bends sound until a whisper seems to come from inside your chest. Tonight, you're going to hear 3 stories from people who ran into that kind of fog. Drivers, runners, paddlers, who all walked away with the same question. Did they stumble into tricks their own senses played, or did the mist conceal something that left a trace? I want you to listen for 2 things as these stories unfold. The pieces you can touch, bumper dents, footprints, a rowboat hauled ashore, and the pieces that live only in memory, the shape that looked wrong, a sound that refused to stop. After each account, I'll lay out what's verifiable, what might be explained by mundane causes, and where the record stops and becomes unresolved. No grand pronouncements, just the facts, the likely hypotheses, and the honest gaps. The first account comes from someone who was driving alone along Highway 101, heading north toward Eureka, on a night when, as he tells it, the fog fell so quickly it felt like someone slammed a curtain across the road. I always drove that stretch at odd hours. It was the kind of route that lets your mind go to places it wouldn't during the day. Long, straight patches, the kind of radio static you don't notice until it stops. That night, I'd left Oakland after work. I remember the coffee gone cold in my mug and the way the highway lights smeared when the fog hit. It wasn't that fog that rolls along the water like a soft blanket. This felt aggressive, like someone had taken a sponge and wrung it across the road. One minute I could see the reflectors. The next minute, my headlights were punching through white nothing. My dash said I'd driven a while, but there was no sense of how long. I slowed to maybe 25, maybe less. I put my hazards on because the road thinned down into curves and I didn't want anyone barreling into the back of me. That's when I saw him, the guy standing on the shoulder just past the guardrail, looking like he belonged there. He had on a jacket, hood up, hands in his pockets. At first he seemed like someone who'd walked off the road to check a map, or maybe a hitchhiker who'd missed his ride. I thought, okay, weird. I kept going. Then I saw him again. This is the part that still gets me. I passed him, and then 2 minutes later, 100 yards up, there he was again, right by the same kind of marker post, not moving. The fog does things to distance, I kept telling myself. I blinked, and the man was gone. I kept driving. But then there was another shape. Not just the same person twice. A hooded figure was stepping into my lane. I slammed the brakes hard enough that the tires squealed and the whole car pitched. For a second, I thought I hit something, like someone lunged in front of me, but there was nothing in my mirrors. I put it into drive, and I took the next turnout, hands shaking like I'd run a marathon. When I pulled over into a lit rest area, thank God there was a little light, I looked at the back of my car. There's a long dent that runs almost the width of the bumper. It's deep, not just a smear. There's no paint transfer, no scuff from another vehicle. Nothing scraped off that would tell us what hit it. I called my parents. I called the non-emergency number for the sheriff. They came out, they took a report, they snapped pictures. I asked the officer if it sounded like I'd hit a guard post or a sign. He said it was possible, but the lack of paint transfer made it odd. He told me he'd log it and file it, said he'd check for surveillance cameras along that stretch, and if anyone else reported anything. I don't know what came of that. I never got a call back. I still have the dent. It's hard to explain how you process that afterward. For a while I cycled through the rational answers. I was tired, really tired. I didn't eat properly that day. Maybe I nodded off for a second and bumped a post at low speed. Maybe there was an arm, a coat, something soft that left no paint. Maybe someone were playing a prank on night drivers, running out and slamming the bumper from behind. I thought of deer hitting the bumper when you don't see carcass or blood, but this thing was along the middle of the bumper, like something pressed a fist into it. I went over it in my head again and again. A hallucination could explain seeing the man twice, but not the dent. A dent that size means contact. Contact means something physical was there. If there was something physical, what was it? I kept checking the rear view the rest of the way north like an idiot. I thought about stopping at a mechanic the next town over, replacing the bumper, pretending it never happened. But you can't unknow the image of a figure stepping into your lane. You can't bank on fog to decide for you which of those explanations to believe. When I called the sheriff, their report number was written on a little slip. I looked up the stretches they said they'd patrol, and it covered the same area. Nothing else came through. For months I watched the car in the driveway like a patient waiting to see if a wound would reopen. The dent was there, persistent, a physical note that something had happened. That's where it stayed. No clear answer, just the bump in metal and the memory. Listen to him when he says the dent had no paint transfer and the police report exists, but went nowhere. That's one of the facts the investigation can actually touch. Everything else, the two sightings, the figure entering the lane, is a matter of perception. Both matter, but they matter differently. Here's what we can line up as objective facts. He was driving alone on Highway 101 at night in heavy fog. Visibility was significantly reduced. He reported seeing a person on the shoulder, then seeing what he believed to be the same person again. He encountered a hooded figure in his lane and braked hard. Afterward, there was a sizable dent across the rear bumper. There was no obvious paint transfer on the dent. He filed a report with law enforcement, but a definitive outcome is not recorded in the information he gave me. Status indefinido. Now, for possible explanations, ranked by plausibility based on those facts. First, the most straightforward, partial contact with an immobile or low-profile object combined with sensory distortion from fatigue and fog. Fog compresses distances. Your perception of speed and timing warps. A steel post, a road maintenance barrier, even a low concrete lip could bruise a bumper without leaving paint from another vehicle. If the narrator braked or swerved at an odd moment because of perceived movement, that low-speed contact could happen without the driver realizing. Second, human interference or a prank. It's less likely but not impossible. Someone could have stepped in front of the car, intentionally or accidentally, and been out of frame when the driver pulled away. The lack of paint transfer weakens the case for a vehicle-on-vehicle collision, but is neutral about a human-caused dent. To coordinate a prank that leaves a bumper dent but disappears into thick fog with no witnesses would suggest either opportunism or familiarity with the location. Third, a purely hallucinatory sequence. Fatigue, monocular vision through fog, and stress can create convincing illusions. Repeating figures, a hooded silhouette stepping into the lane. But this explanation struggles to account for a tangible dent. If the narrator had been sleep-drunk and collided with a stationary object, the dent could still be real. But then, the visual encounters might be misremembered or conflated. Fourth, less likely but worth listing, an animal impact without obvious remains, or some form of environmental anomaly. Deer strikes usually leave biological evidence. An impact with a roadside marker could leave a dent without paint transfer. Yet many of those are made of materials that would scratch paint. The lack of scraping residue is one of those stubborn details. Finally, and importantly, we mark some items indefinido, meaning there is no recorded resolution given to me. We don't have confirmation from the sheriff's office that they found anything. We don't have witness accounts from other drivers. We don't know the exact speed at the moment of impact. Those gaps prevent a definitive conclusion. So where does that leave us? Most likely, a combination of low-speed contact with an object or shallow impact plus sensory distortion made the situation feel more menacing than it may have been. Possible, but less likely. A deliberate human interference or prank that left the dent. Less likely still, a purely hallucinatory episode that coincidentally resulted in a dent through some other unnoticed event. Unexplained. The repetition of the same figure and the experience of someone appearing in the lane, coupled with the lack of any corroborative evidence beyond the dent and the police report being logged with no public outcome, If that first case makes you want to keep watching for more forensic tidbits and for patterns, stick with me. This is exactly the kind of investigation I live for. Subscribe now and you'll catch the rest of these investigations as we go deeper into what fog does to people and to facts. The second story comes from a college student who'd gone home for a break and decided to run the old loop behind his hometown. He calls it a loop he'd done 100 times. 3 miles, a mixture of creekside single-track and packed dirt, a place where in daylight you could count the switchbacks by the way the pines throw their shadows. That day, the fog had crept in low, so low that it swallowed the creek in a grey veil. I was on campus for the semester break and needed to clear my head, so I went back to that loop I knew like the back of my hand. It used to be where I jogged with friends, where you timed your pace by the bend at the big alder tree. That afternoon the fog came in heavy and quick, like a tide. The first mile was normal, breath-heavy, shoes on soft ground. Then the GPS on my watch started acting wrong. It told me I'd only done a mile when my legs said otherwise. At 3 miles into what should be a 3-mile loop, the trail still felt like the middle of nowhere. My watch said I'd done the distance, but I was still surrounded by trees and that syrup-thick fog. Sound got strange. It started as this low drone, almost like a wind through a vent, but not wind. The sound seemed to hold position, and as I moved, it seemed to reposition itself relative to me. I stopped to check my bearings, and the drone didn't. It would drop and rise like someone was moving around me and never quite changing speed. The visibility was maybe 15-20 feet, enough to see the next bend, not enough to see anything that could be more than 6 or 7 feet tall and clearly human. I kept thinking it would resolve. I turned a corner, and there it was, a shape taller than any person I'd ever seen standing on that trail, black against the gray, maybe 7 feet, maybe more. It wasn't moving toward me. It was swaying, almost like it was balanced on one leg and then the other, but when I stepped closer, it didn't step back or forward. My heartbeat went loud. I didn't feel like I could think. I can tell you now, I don't know if it was human. It didn't move like any person. The sound seemed to come from it, this low, fluctuating hum that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I ran. I don't remember if I sprinted or just fled. My watch kept pinging. Lap 1, lap 2, but nothing matched. When I burst out of the woods onto the trailhead, the sun, or whatever light was trying to be the sun, felt too bright. I looked back, and there was nothing. No footprints that weren't mine, no bent brush, no sign that anything massive had been standing on the packed dirt. I told myself maybe I'd seen a deer standing up weird, or some tarp hung on a tree that looked like a person from the corner of my eye. I told myself about GPS drift and low light. But I've run that loop dozens of times, and I know what a person looks like at 20 feet in daylight, and this was wrong in a way I can't square with tired eyes or a bad GPS reading. He remembers GPS anomalies. His watch said he had completed miles he had not, and a drone that seemed to follow. Those are the details that make the account stick in the investigative ledger because they're measurable phenomena. GPS can be checked for error characteristics later. A low-frequency sound can be analyzed for properties if recorded. But he didn't record any of it. He only has memory, which is messy. As he describes it, the silhouette's height and the way it swayed made the sighting feel non-human, but there was no physical residue left behind. No footprints, no trampled brush, nothing that could be pointed to and said, "That was here." And that's the knife edge these stories live on. Vivid, convincing subjective experience, sometimes with objective traces, sometimes without. For now, the fog is still a character in both of these accounts. It thickens distance, it warps sound, and it makes the ordinary appear uncanny. The driver had metal proof, a dent. The runner had only a memory and GPS oddities. Both, however, walked away feeling that something about the way the world was behaving that night was off. You can feel the tension when he says the thing didn't move like a person. That's when doubt starts to crowd in. Did the fog do this to him, or did something else? He got out, and he ran. He didn't find a boat. He didn't find a dent. There was no physical trace. Still, the image of that dark swaying silhouette is lodged in his mind like a splinter. He keeps replaying the sound, the low drone, and the way his watch refused to match what his feet felt. When he tells the story, he keeps circling the same point. He's an experienced runner. He knows what's where on the trail. He knows the loop. That's part of what makes the experience stick. It's not a tourist in a strange place. It's someone who knows the normal and was confronted with the abnormal. That's where we'll leave this one for now, with the shape in the fog and the runners sprint out of the trees. There are still missing pieces, no physical evidence, no recordings, no third-party witnesses, and so the account sits as a high-fidelity subjective experience with measurable oddities in device data that the narrator could not reconcile in the moment. We haven't yet gotten to the third story, about a pair of kayakers on Willapa Bay who heard oars cutting through fog and later found a small wooden boat hauled up on shore. But before we go there, let's hold the picture. Two different environments, two different sets of senses under pressure, and in one case a dent that insists on being something that happened in the material world. The question that hangs now is simple and stubborn. When fog rearranges what you can trust, how do you test which pieces are real? The runner's breath still ragged in the memory, the fog thinning like a curtain being drawn back in stages. He says it took him days to stop glancing over his shoulder on short walks. When you hear him describe the way the sound followed him, you get the sense that it's not just about fear, it's about a new epistemic rule he had to adopt. Do not trust your instruments in the fog, and do not trust your eyes when the world is compressed to a few dozen feet. We'll come back to him. There's more that needs to be unpacked. Acoustic phenomena, the way fog traps and channels sound, the peculiarities of human vision in low-contrast scenes. We'll look at how GPS errors can exaggerate disorientation and how the brain fills gaps when it needs to make sense of motion and shape. We'll line up what would make that silhouette seem 7 feet tall when the reality could have been a leaning tree or a person on an embankment. But for now, imagine the runner stopping at the trailhead, chest heaving, watching the grey melt away into the kind of light that makes ordinary things ordinary again. Imagine him looking back and finding nothing. That's the place where doubt seeds. That's the line we cross from having an experience to being asked to explain it. And beyond that line, the one where tangible traces are found and police reports are filed, there's the third account waiting. Kayakers on Willapa Bay, sounds of oars that never grow closer, a brief glimpse of a boat through a break in the fog, and wet footprints leading inland. That one has evidence too, but it moves the timeline and logistics into sharper, weirder questions. We'll get to it next. We put in at the usual spot on Willapa Bay, just as the fog closed around the marsh grass. Edwin and I knew that stretch, had launched from that tiny ramp in every season, so when it became a white room, we didn't panic. We slowed down, kept strokes short, let the sound of blades be the thing that guided us. The water felt like glass. The world stopped being a horizon and became a handful of nearby things. The slap of our paddles, the scrape of water along the hull, the call of a gull somewhere off to starboard. At first it was almost comical. The fog muffled everything until our voices sounded like they were in a can. We joked about ghost ships and old fishermen. We kept our eyes peeled because currents pick up close to the marsh and you don't want to be surprised. Then I heard it, the soft, regular sound of oars cutting rhythmically. Not a motor, not the clack of paddle blades on a kayak. No, a slower, deeper cadence, like a pair of oars in long, heavy strokes. It came from somewhere off our port bow. At first I thought it was another boat making for the same channel, fine, easy to handle. I called, "Hey, boat," and there was no answer, only that steady rowing sound. It didn't change, As we kept paddling, the sound kept pace before us, almost like it was matching our speed but not getting any closer. I looked through a thin break in the fog and thought I saw a small wooden rowboat, dark, low to the water, 2 people maybe. But when I tried to focus, when Edwin angled his head and shouted, the boat wasn't there. The sound stayed. It hovered at a distance that felt constant. You get that weird sense on water where direction is teased apart from distance. A sound can sit where you think the bow is, and the bow is not there when you look. We drifted, paddled, called again, but the sound didn't respond. It simply kept its pace and rhythm. Every now and then the fog would thin for half a breath, and there'd be that outline. Then the fog would thicken, and it would be gone. It was like looking at a lighthouse that kept blinking off and on, except there was no visible light, only the oar's rhythm. We were seasoned enough to know when to quit being curious. The tide there moves in strange ways. Currents can take you faster than you expect, and visibility that low makes colliding with a log or another vessel a real risk. So when, after what felt like 20 minutes but could have been 5, we decided to head for shore, we kept our heads down and paddled hard toward the marsh. The oar sound stayed with us until we were within shouting distance of the put-in. It never once sped up to overtake us. It never once drew nearer. Then, as we hauled our kayaks up, the sound stopped. Completely. On the beach, we stood dripping, towels on our shoulders, and that's when we saw the prints. Bare feet, smallish, imprinted in the mud, wet and darker where they hit. They led up into the scrub along a line that disappeared between the roots. They were fresh. They weren't our prints. They didn't look like a boot, didn't look like a shoe. They looked like someone had come ashore barefoot and walked inland, and there was a set of 9 or 10 marks that went into the grass and stopped where the path narrowed. A little further down the shoreline, tucked beneath some wrack and driftwood, was a small wooden rowboat pulled up high enough that the stern was on wet sand. It was the kind of craft you could manage alone. It had wet oarlocks, water in the bilge, no one around. We stood there, and I remember saying, "Where is the person? Edwin, where did they go?" He scanned the tree line with the flashlight and found nothing. We walked inland where the prints trailed off and looked for footprints spliced into leaf litter or a crushed patch in the grass. There were little disturbances, but it was bunched up marsh, hard to read. No sign of clothing, no glove, no towel, nothing like that. The rowboat was not tied to anything. It had no name, no registration that we could see. It could have been there for hours or minutes. The tide line matched the hour we were out, but I can't tell you the exact minute the tide pushed a boat up because we didn't take the time to time it. We both felt the hairs on our arms prickling. We didn't feel safe. We loaded the boats back and left. We didn't report it to the sheriff right away. Why? Maybe embarrassment? Maybe the same instinct that makes you not want to admit you got spooked. Maybe because when you tell a tale like that, people ask if you were drinking or if you were pranking each other. But the prints were there. The boat was there. We couldn't explain how the sound kept pace. And then the vessel was gone from where the sound seemed to come, and then a rowboat was on shore further down. It suggested someone had been out there and came ashore before we reached that stretch. It suggested a timeline that didn't match our perceptions, sound that kept a distance, a vessel that was visible and then vanished, footprints leading inland. When I tell people, the obvious rationalizations are the first things they reach for. Maybe it was another paddler who snuck in behind us and then got out before we saw them. Maybe someone had the rowboat stashed and simply rowed out, then pulled it in down shore. Maybe the oar sounds were amplified by the fog. The reflection of sound over water makes noises behave like actors who forget their lines. We thought of people on the marsh, homeless folks who use small boats sometimes, fishermen who leave craft on shore. Those are plausible. But it still felt like something more precise was missing. Why didn't the sound close? Why was the boat pulled up in the position it was in, relative to our path? And why did those prints look so deliberate, barefoot and heading into the trees? A few things about that night feel like small iron nails in the memory. 1. The oar sound kept a steady distance. It didn't crescendo like something overtaking us. It maintained that eerie neutrality. 2. We both saw the outline of a small rowboat through breaks in the fog, more than once, and it disappeared when the fog thickened. 3. Wet, barefoot prints led inland near the place where the rowboat sat hauled up. 4. No one responded to our calls. Those are the things I can point to. Everything else, how long it took, exact tide times, whether the sheriff ever followed up, are details I can't fill in now. Indefinido. Let's line those up as objective facts. 2 experienced paddlers were on Willapa Bay in dense fog. They heard regular rowing sounds to their port. Through thin breaks in the fog, they perceived a small wooden rowboat. When they reached shore, they found wet, barefoot footprints leading inland and a small wooden rowboat hauled up on the sand further down the shore. There was no visible person at the time of discovery. The exact timing of the events relative to tides and any official reports is not provided. Indefinido. Possible explanations present themselves immediately, and I want to be clear-eyed about each. First, the simplest. Another human vessel. Someone could have been rowing in the fog, kept a steady pace parallel to them, and then come ashore downstream of the kayakers. That would explain oar noises, the brief visual of a rowboat, wet prints leading inland and the boat hauled up on shore. It would also explain the lack of response. If the other person wanted to avoid contact, they could keep silence and pull away. This scenario is logistically straightforward. The hiccup is the way the sound behaved, maintaining a constant perceived distance, even as the kayaks changed speed and direction. But that could be a quirk of acoustics. Second, acoustic mirage. Over calm water with fog, sound reflects and refracts in ways that confuse both bearing and distance. A rowing rhythm could sound like it is moving parallel to you when it is moving away. A boat's oars hitting the surface can be focused or smeared by layers of air at different temperatures. Acoustic ducts over water are real. They can bend sound so it seems to come from a different place. If this is the case, the rowboat the paddlers glimpsed might have been farther off than it seemed, and the prints and boat ashore might belong to someone entirely unrelated who had been on the beach earlier or later. Third, staging or prank. It's possible someone planned to create a scene, pulled a small boat up on shore, walked barefoot to leave prints, then rowed out to let their sound echo toward others. Practically, this would be more difficult to coordinate without being seen, but not impossible. The logistics are tricky if you consider tides and timing and the need to avoid detection by other boaters, but not inconceivable. Fourth, less likely but worth mentioning, misperception without a human third party. A floating log or mass of seaweed can clap in a way that sounds rhythmic. A rock or an old buoy can, under certain conditions, produce repeated thumps. Those sounds, coupled with fog and expectation, could be perceived as oars. That would leave the presence of an actual rowboat on the beach as something coincidental. The paddlers could have missed it earlier and only noticed it when they came ashore. And finally, unexplained elements remain. The timing, the way the sound kept pace, and then there was a pulled-up boat downstream, creates a small paradox. If a boat was rowing steadily, why did it not respond to shouted calls? If it came ashore and left footprints, where did the person go from there? We don't have data on whether anyone was reported missing, whether the boat had distinguishing marks, or whether local campers or fishers recognized it. Those pieces are indefinido. Now, weighing these hypotheses for probability based on the facts, most likely another human boater who came ashore downstream of the kayakers, either intentionally avoiding contact or simply not aware that it would alarm the paddlers. This accounts for the sounds, the brief sighting, the footprints and the rowboat, possible but with caveats. Acoustic mirage creating an illusion of proximity with an unrelated boat that had been hauled ashore earlier or later. This ranks high because fog and water are notorious for messing with sound, but it struggles to explain a coordinated set of clues unless the timing was coincidental. Less likely, an elaborate prank or staging, feasible but would require someone who knew the area, the tides, and who could move stealthily. Not impossible, but more complex than necessary. Unexplained. The specific way the sound refused to grow louder as the kayaks approached, and the absence of any person to question at the shore. These are anomalies that push the case into the ambiguous. What ties these three accounts together is more than fog. It's the fog acting as a stage manager, shifting how distance and sound are read. It's the repeated experience of otherwise capable people, drivers, runners, paddlers, finding themselves out of time or out of phase with their environment. In the first story, the dent in the bumper is the stubborn physical artifact. In the third, the footprints and the boat perform the same role. The runner's account sits between those poles, sensory anomalies and device errors without a piece of metal or a piece of wood to anchor the tale to the physical world. Let's do a rapid cross-check of shared elements and how they weigh against different explanations. All three include fog, thick enough to compress vision to a few dozen feet. All three report sounds behaving oddly, whether the absence of expected ambient noise, a persistent drone, or rowing strokes that hold distance. Two of the three include physical traces, dent, footprints, and a boat. The repetition of a figure and the sensation of being followed or observed shows up in the first and second accounts. Hypothesis 1. Human agency, people intentionally or accidentally creating encounters. This hypothesis scores high in stories with physical traces. A prank, a hostile encounter, or just another person moving through fog could create the impressions the witnesses describe. In stories 1 and 3, the dent and the boat prints are consistent with a physical presence. Story 2 has less to support that, but a person standing on an embankment or someone in tall clothing could look enormous in low contrast. Overall, human agency is a strong contender, especially given that humans frequent these locales and have reasons to be there at odd hours. Hypothesis 2. Environmental perceptual distortion, fog plus acoustics plus fatigue. This one scales across all accounts because fog does what fog does. It blurs distance, it absorbs and reflects sound, and it reduces contrast so the brain fills in missing data. GPS drift and device errors are well documented in low visibility conditions and dense canopy. The runner's watch misreporting distance is a textbook example of instrument error by signal loss. The way sound clings to a band over water is a physical phenomenon that could explain the feeling that something is keeping pace. This explanation is likely to play a role in every story to some degree. Hypothesis 3. Mechanical collision or environmental damage. This is a focused explanation for story 1, bumper damage from a post or low-profile object. It's simple and consistent with the facts, though the lack of paint transfer complicates it. For story 3, mechanical explanations are less relevant unless you hypothesize debris making rowing-like sounds and coincidentally a boat ashore. For story 2, there's no mechanical damage to fit this theory. Hypothesis 4. Less common or anomalous processes, not claiming supernatural causes, but recognizing that not every observation resolves. This acknowledges that there may be combinations of factors, unknown human actions, or simple gaps in our data that leave parts of the episodes truly unresolved. If I had to assign a short verdict for each story, with the caveat that this is an interpretation from limited data, here's where I land. Story 1. Highway driver. Most likely, low-speed contact with an immobile or low-profile object combined with fog-induced perceptual distortion. Possible, human interference. Less likely, pure hallucination accounting for both the sighting and the dent. Unexplained. Why the dent had no paint transfer and why the officer's follow-up is not traceable in the details given. Status: likely with unresolved elements. Story 2, runner. Most likely, perceptual distortion amplified by fog and possibly acoustical effects. GPS drift, increased disorientation. Possible, an unusual but natural object, a leaning tree, a tarp, or a person on an embankment misperceived as a tall silhouette. Less likely, an actual 7-foot figure or a non-human actor. Status: subjective, experience with no physical trace, remains unresolved. Story 3, kayakers. Most likely, another human-operated rowboat that came ashore downstream of the paddlers, with fog and acoustic effects making the approach feel mystifying. Possible, acoustic mirage combined with a coincidental beaching of a boat at an unrelated time. Less likely, an elaborate staged event or non-human source of awe-like sounds. Status: plausible human presence with conflicting timeline. A few cross-cutting observations change how we weigh these probabilities. 2 instances with physical residue tip the overall case toward human or mechanical interaction being present in at least some of these events. The runner's lack of residue could be a purely perceptual event, or it could be a human presence that left no trace. The consistency of auditory anomalies across different environments strengthens the environmental explanation thread. Fog and water and woods have a way of turning ordinary cues into uncanny ones. What we don't find in these accounts are corroborating third-party witnesses, clear surveillance footage, or physical evidence that unequivocally ties one explanation to another. No CCTV of the dent incident, no time-stamped recordings of the runner's drone, no registration or identifying marks on the rowboat. Those absences matter. They make the most responsible position. We prefer the simplest explanations that fit the evidence, but we leave open the parts that do not fit. So where does that leave us with the title question? Discovering the truth behind these 3 terrifying fog horror stories. The composite truth is mixed. Fog materially degrades evidence. It makes sight and sound unreliable and can confuse instruments. It is also a cover under which human actions can take place more easily. In 2 of the 3 stories, tangibles, metal and wood, offer weight to the idea that something physical occurred. In the runner's account, the weight sits in memory and in the odd behavior of his GPS. Put together, the most probable overall explanation is a hybrid, environmental effects creating disorientation and perceptual distortion, with human or mechanical presence accounting for the physical traces in stories 1 and 3. But certain elements, repeating figures, the drone that held its distance, the way the fog seemed to freeze a moment, remain unexplained by mundane mechanisms alone as far as our information goes. That is not an argument for supernatural causation. It is a careful admission of uncertainty. What I come back to after weighing the facts is this: treat fog as an active hazard first, then an interpretive hazard second. It changes how your senses and your devices report the world. If you are driving, slow more than you think you need to. If you're running in a wooded loop at dusk, take a light and a partner. If you're paddling in a bay and you hear something that won't behave like a normal sound, prioritize getting to shore safely and documenting what you can without putting yourself at risk. Each narrator carries a different aftermath. The driver now checks his bumper before every trip and avoids that stretch at night when possible. The runner avoids the loop when fog sits low. He still has the image of a swaying shape lodged in his mind. The kayaker and Edwin talk about pulling the boat farther up the beach whenever they go out, and they don't paddle that edge alone anymore. The dent, the footprint, the silhouette, they are small stakes in a larger question about how we know what we think we know. If you've had anything like these experiences, if fog rearranged your reality or left a mark on your car or your memory, tell us about it in the comments. Share where it happened, what the facts were, and whether you found any evidence afterward. I'll read through them. I won't promise a definitive answer, but I will promise to look at the facts with the same skepticism and curiosity we used here. Some threads in this set of stories will likely thread into others. Fog-bound encounters on coastal roads and marshes, auditory anomalies, instruments failing at critical moments. Those are the kinds of patterns I keep an eye on. For now, the safest takeaway is caution. Fog is not merely atmosphere, it is an agent that can complicate judgment, hide human activity, and leave you with a memory that feels as tangible as metal or wood, even when it isn't. If this investigation spoke to you, and you want more deep dives into unexplained events, where we try to separate what can be verified from what remains mysterious, hit subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss future episodes. And if you have any theories about these 3 stories, acoustic mirage, prank, collision, or something else, leave that in the comments. I read them all, and I'm genuinely interested in what you think. Thanks for listening to these 3 accounts. Be careful out there. Fog has a way of making familiar places strange. Share this with someone who loves a good mystery, and if you've got a story from your own night drive, run, or paddle, tell it below. We'll meet it the same way we met these, with attention to detail, a willingness to test simple explanations first, and an openness to admit what we still can't explain.